Good evening. Good evening, muy buenas noches. My name is Avidan Rodriguez, and I am the 20th president at the University at Albany, and it is my sincere pleasure and honor to be here with you this evening. Thanks to each and every one of you for being with us and joining us at the University at Albany and the New York State Writers Institute, telling the truth in a post-truth world, and to tonight's panel discussion. These have been energizing, thought-provoking, and excellent sets of discussions. The New York State Writers Institute is an extraordinary asset at the University at Albany, the region, and the country, and it truly exemplifies several of the university's core priorities and values. Inclusive excellence, as it highlights the diverse and multidisciplinary voices and the excellent perspectives it presents, including the importance of excellence and diversity. Globalization, as it continues to develop and expand its international portfolio of authors and artists that span the globe, and public engagement through its programs such as this extraordinary conference and tonight's event, which are open and free to our community. The Writers Institute also embodies the powerful role of the arts and humanities that they play in an urban public research university. I want to take this opportunity to thank Bill Kennedy and Paul Grandal and the entire Writers Institute team for the excellent programs and critical conversations they convene. We are also delighted that our community has turned out in very large numbers to engage in these critical conversations. So thanks to all of you, and also very special thank you to all our sponsors. The topic of this conference could not be more timely or more central to today's national and global political and policy climate. These are issues that must be explored in all their divergent and different aspects. We must carefully and critically analyze these topics which are germane to our global society. The University at Albany is in a unique position to do just this through our leading expertise in public policy, political science, cybersecurity, history, communications, and computer science, among other fields, as well through our nationally acclaimed New York State Writers Institute. Some of our faculty experts have been part of this symposium, and we will continue to be active participants in this absolutely critical conversation, because together we must lead to generate positive and engaging change. As Paul Grandal tweeted this morning, this is what democracy looks like. This is what the University at Albany looks like. And I hope that each and every one of you will agree with me that today there is nothing more critical than the future of our democracy. Now, please join me in expressing our deepest appreciation and giving a very warm welcome to Paul Grandal, who will introduce our very distinguished panelists and the moderator this evening. Paul Grandal, please.
Wow. Thank you, President Rodriguez. Very nice, wonderful words, and I appreciate the kind thoughts for our Writers Institute team. So here we are at panel 6 of 6. I will say a few words at the very end. There will be a book signing and public reception. We hope everyone joins us just to the right out here in the Levitt room. There'll be some light refreshments. So here we go. To thank our wonderful sponsors one more time, the people who helped make this possible. The premier sponsors, the Times Union and the Craig Newmark Philanthropic Fund. The presenting sponsors, Bean Communications and Renaissance Corporation of Albany, in memory of John C. Egan. The Albany Public Library Foundation, Center for Law and Justice, Foundation for Information Resources, Science and Technology, Hodgson Russ LLP, M&T Bank, St. Peter's Health Partners, the Law, Youth, and Citizenship Program of the New York State Bar Association, UHY LLP, Pernilla Dake, Paul Grandal, William Kennedy, Bernard F. Connors Foundation, Foy Foundation Advised Fund, Catherine Gibson, Margaret and Jonathan Harvey, and the New York Newspapers Foundation. Please give all our sponsors a round of applause. Now our distinguished panelists. Richard Tofel is president of Pro Publica, the Pulitzer Prize-winning nonprofit investigative news organization. He is a former Wall Street Journal assistant publisher and former general counsel to the Rockefeller Foundation. His books include Why American Newspapers Gave Away the Future. Please welcome Richard Tofel. Bill Keller is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and editor-in-chief of the Marshall Project, an investigative journalism initiative focused on criminal justice issues. He is the former executive editor of the New York Times, where he also served as a reporter and a columnist. Please welcome Bill Keller. Pamela Newkirk is an award-winning journalist and professor of journalism at NYU, who previously worked at New York Newsday and also at the Knickerbocker News here in Albany. She's the author of 4 books, including Within the Veil, Black Journalists, White Media, which won the National Press Club Award for Media Criticism. Please welcome Pamela Newkirk. Jim Rich is executive editor of HuffPost, and prior to joining the Huffington Post, he was editor-in-chief of the New York Daily News, where he oversaw that newspaper's coverage of the New York City Police Department's use of the nuisance abatement law that was awarded the 2017 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service. Please welcome Jim Rich. And our moderator, Rex Smith, editor of the Times-Union, my former boss, host of the Media Project on WAMC Northeast Public Radio. He also writes a weekly column on media issues for the Times-Union. He's a former editor of The Record in Troy. He has served as president of the New York State Press Association and twice served as a Pulitzer Prize juror. Please welcome Rex Smith.
Oh, newspapermen, we've such interesting people. I have to be local to appreciate that, sorry. Welcome, thank you all for being here, for coming. You honor us with your presence in this evening by your commitment to the important issues that we're discussing in this symposium, and we're very grateful to you. You know, the people on this stage, you know, we could think of ourselves as having at one time been important people, like in the 19th century. Napoleon, conqueror of Europe, creator of the civil code that is followed still by 1/4 of the world. Napoleon said, a journalist is a grumbler, a censurer, a regent of sovereigns. 4 hostile newspapers are more to be feared than 1,000 bayonets. I like that. Don't you like that?
I thought Trump said that.
Yeah, if only. The problem is, you know, we don't fight with bayonets anymore. We've got drones and all kinds of other matters. And so the role of newspapers has changed. The role of the media has changed, of journalists. And certainly, at least, our position and the way we deliver. In fact, the first thing that we're going to do before we open the discussion is change the terms of the conversation. because this is, I believe, supposed to be, they say, about the end of newspapers, ? And actually, we all know that the medium of ink on crushed trees is not long for this world. We in this room may live long enough so that there will still be paper in use. I often speculate that we're actually going to be embedded with chips. We put chips in puppies now. We're going to have chips in us, and you can activate them to learn things instead of having to read anything. It might happen. But we certainly know that newspapers are not primarily print media much anymore. So let's just say that this is a panel discussion, a conversation about the future of well-staffed, beat-based, local journalism organizations, because that's what newspapers have been. And you probably heard, those of you who were here last night heard Bob Schieffer talk about the fact that we've lost 126 newspapers in the last 12 years. The newspaper staffs in America, newsroom staffs, are half of what they were in 2007. And so this must have an impact on journalism. So you're probably wondering why and how this happened. Dick Tofel will tell us, won't you? Wasn't that the topic of one of your books?
Yeah.
What happened? Where are we, and what has happened in this environment?
Well, if you wanted to reduce it to one word, the internet happened.
The internet.
And I think it changed in this way. It did change everything, right? First, you had an explosion in the number of sources of information and a collapse in barriers to entry to provide that information. So people get choices, and they have many other choices, and that puts enormous pressure. That, of course, happened really in 1994, 1995, 1996. The business only, interestingly, went to wherever starting in about 2005. I think one of the important things to remind people is that the best year ever in the history of the American newspaper business was actually the year 2000. So well after the consumer internet came in. But what happened starting in 2005 and has literally continued every single quarter since is the business model collapsed, principally on the advertising side and then on the circulation side as well. The competition with digital advertising, the classic line is digital pennies for print dollars. And I could go on, but I'll keep it short. Let me just say one thing about digital advertising that I think is very important to put this in context. And that is, it's not as complicated as people make it out. It's a supply and demand problem. Facebook produces, hundreds of millions. Every time someone creates an item on Facebook, every time any one of us does, we create an advertising opportunity. So the supply of digital advertising is pretty much going to the moon. The demand for advertising generally, and this has been true for a century, rises at the level of the GDP. So you can trade off between TV and radio and internet and newspapers and magazines, but overall, advertising rises with the GDP or falls if you're in recession. So you've got, this is literally economics 101. If supply is going to the moon and demand is rising very slowly, then prices are going to fall. And they're going to fall, I think, inexorably. I mean, a mathematician would say they are falling asymptotically to zero. So that's basically where we are. And the net result of it is that in the newspaper business, to go back to the previous title of this, Rex, that every quarter for newspaper companies, as best we can measure it, has been negative now for 50 quarters in a row. And there is nobody I know of that thinks that's going to turn around for the industry in general. There are some winners, some losers, but for the industry in general, that seems to be likely to continue as far as the eye can see.
I might add that everybody on this stage started out in the newspaper business. There's only one still doing it. This may make you think there's something wrong with somebody up here. To that point, let me just ask Bill Keller, who runs a not-for-profit newsroom with a specialized topic. They are the specialized reporting center on justice issues. Is that an accurate way to put the Marshall Project?
That'll do, sure.
All right. Is there any hope for general interest local newsrooms then, given the bleak financial picture that Dick has just sketched?
Any hope? Well, first of all, I agree with everything that Dick said. I would add just one small caveat, which is I worked for two newspapers that were at the time at two newspaper cities, Portland, Oregon, and Dallas. And in both of those cities became one newspaper cities before there was serious competition from the internet. So before the internet killed newspapers, newspaper publishers were killing newspapers because they wanted monopolies. So a little bit of credit to the
capitalism,
the origin story of the demise of newspapers. I mean, I tend to be an optimist by nature. I think the general interest news outlets will survive. The print newspapers will survive for a while in communities where, mostly small communities where the local laundry and the local diner still like to have a newspaper to hand out to their customers. But for the most part, I mean, and they'll fade slowly. You know, the New York Times will be the Sunday New York Times for a while, probably before it becomes the totally online New York Times. But no, they're doomed, basically, is the short answer.
Makes me glad
Having
to be
a cheery evening up here.
old as I am. Yes, it's a good thing. So how much of this, this has been so far a purely economic model. As long as we're going from left to right, Pamela, let me ask you, to what extent do you think that some of the demise might be attributable to poor practice of journalism? You know, you're a former journalist. Well, you're still a journalist, excuse me. You're a journalism professor now, though.
You.
Thank you, absolutely. But I mean, you're teaching it now, and so you have an opportunity to have a bit of remove to actually see what's going on. Do you think that the practice of journalism bears some of the responsibility?
Oh, without a doubt. And I would say there's one caveat to the doom and gloom that we've heard so far, is that circulation is surging. You can call it the Trump bump. At the New York Times, at the Washington Post, at the Wall Street Journal, surely in the top 10 markets, circulation is like going through the roof. The problem is that ad revenue is still declining. So I would say that the business model, to your question, probably does have something to do with the way the industry has treated vast segments of the population. It may even be a good thing for advertising not to determine how news is gathered and disseminated. That could be a bright spot. I would say it creates opportunities for people to actually cover news that affects wide swaths of the American population, be it the poor, you know, the white working class, or the black working class, or people in the hill towns, or people who are not accustomed to having reporters care about their lives. And so I think the collapse of the economic model that has supported the news industry for so long could present opportunities for other kinds of models. If you went to a purely circulation model, you may be able to cover the news that I know young people, my students, go to the internet for. You know, to hear about Trayvon Martin, they couldn't go to the New York Times initially. They couldn't go to their local paper. They had to go online to find news about what happened. So with all the doom and gloom, there are opportunities.
Of course, one of the reasons why the local papers probably didn't carry as much about Trayvon Martin is because it was so readily available in so many other places, because the local newspapers are trying hard to be specific to their communities, right?
Well, I mean, even in that community where it happened,
Oh,
you could
oh,
not find
right.
it in the newspaper. So that is still something, you know, the same can be said of, you know, police brutality. I mean, from my days of reporting, I could have written a series on police brutality, except most editors were not really interested in that story. It's now that we have videotaped, you know, interactions between police and young blacks or black males, that now more people are even open to the possibility that that has been going on.
So Jim Rich has an interesting role. I think he's never worked for a profitable news organization.
I can confirm that, thank you.
But look, you worked for, there's a term in newspapering called the wood, and that is on the tabloids, like the New York Daily News, which Jim used to edit. That's the great big headline on the front, and the term comes from the old days of hot lead type. The lead would splinter if it was cut that big, so they made the big headlines out of wood. So the Daily News, to a certain extent, lives or dies based upon the wood, the front page. And your editorship was marked by some really creative front pages, really interesting stuff. So to a certain extent, you were really trying to reflect what might speak to the community that you were serving, which I think Pam was talking about. To what extent, and talk about this a little bit, how you weigh, when you're in charge of a news organization, reaching a community with what it wants, with what you think might sell, versus what you think they really need.
Well, that's interesting, and I'm glad that Pamela brought that up, because I was thinking about this a little bit earlier, and you know, the Daily News was always considered the voice of the working class in New York City, and there's this old story, I don't even know whether it was true or not, but that one big advertiser had said to the head of advertising at the Daily News years ago, you know, we don't advertise with you guys because your readers are our shoplifters. Right. And so there's always that.
That was the Post.
It was the Post, but come on, I've co-opted it over the years. But
Good one. It's a good one.
The Post and the News not far off, though, as far as readership goes, for the most part. But so okay, so then with that as the backdrop, let's talk a little bit about what we did while I was editor. And you know, we pulled no punches. We covered a lot of issues that were very important to a large swath of our readership, mostly working class across all ethnicities and races. And a funny thing happened. Those people loved it, but the advertisers hated it. And so the pressure that was applied from the few advertisers we had left was immense. And so that was a constant friction, and there's always that friction that exists perpetually in this industry. But combined with that was a small percentage of our readers who were very vocal, who also complained. And you could see the dynamic. Those were the people the advertisers were worried about, and those were the people that they were selling to. They weren't selling to the large majority of our readers. And in there is the dilemma, I think, for newspapers as a whole, and it goes to a little bit about what everybody here has talked about. And I think that there's really been, over the past 20 years or so, there's really been a lack of awareness on the entire, I'll put it on the entire industry, not on either side, editorial or business. There's probably a little blame on both sides to truly address that. Again, it happens to a lesser degree at other publications, but that dynamic plays out, I think, across the majority of newspapers.
What does that look like when you say the pressure from advertisers? How do you feel that when you're the editor in a newsroom?
Well, the publisher of the paper would probably come into my office and say, "What the hell are you doing? You just lost this a $2 million account," or whatever it was. You know, I'm exaggerating a little bit. and that would usually, result in a spirited conversation with the publisher walking out of my office more angry than he had come in, and then eventually leading to me no longer working there. So I mean, I think that's pretty much how the whole thing plays out. I'm not the first one to have that,
And it also looks like in New York City, you didn't have a Bronx Bureau. You have one of 5 boroughs that really had no coverage. And why is that? Because it did not have a big economic base. It did not have a lot of businesses, and
Correct.
that goes back to advertising, right?
And that was strictly a financial decision. To be perfectly blunt, I will say that under my watch, we at least started covering all of the borough's courts, which we had not beforehand. Again, because of finance. So yes, you're 100% correct.
Interesting. By the way, I work for a publisher who's never done that to me. I'm really a very lucky guy. I don't even know.
Do you have his number?
Yeah. I do. It's a great thing. I find out secondhand when advertisers have canceled. It's really interesting. But the pressure is undeniable. What about that question of Bill, this is probably the case at the Times, too. This has always been what Pamela pointed out about limiting geographic coverage to that where the affluence resides. This critique has always applied to the Times and to every other news organization, right? How do you, well, let's say, justify that? How do you handle that kind of a situation?
How do you justify paying more attention to the affluent readers than to the less affluent readers?
Yeah.
I'd always thought of it as sort of the affluent readers subsidizing the coverage that we felt a moral responsibility to do, the coverage of New York, which is becoming less and less, actually. Although that's because the Times is making a bet on being a national, on continuing to be a national news outlet as opposed to a New York news outlet. And the horrible choices that you have to make. But yeah, it's the proliferation of styles sections and T Magazine are underwriting the coverage of poverty, refugees, the Trump administration's follies, health care, all of those issues that we ought to be covering. But the Times is the Times. It's it's a rich newspaper, and it has a reputation for being a valuable platform for advertisers and for subscribers. So there aren't a lot of papers that can do the same thing.
And to that point, I would just add the reason that there was so much friction was because of the dire circumstance of the moment. Okay, so these sort of things would have happened in the past, over the years, where the Daily News or another paper would have done a piece of coverage that would have led to an advertiser canceling, its account, and the advertising department said, okay, well, fine, we've still got this other, this other wagon full of advertisers to rely on, and you don't have that anymore. So again, the heightened desperation, and that has the opportunity to affect journalism. I like to think that it didn't in our case, but I mean, again, subconsciously, it's difficult to completely rule that out.
Well, it's hard not to be less ambitious. I sent Paul Grandal and a reporter and a photographer to Malawi when everybody else was embedding photographer-reporter teams with the troops invading Iraq. We went to sub-Saharan Africa to track the humanitarian crisis there. We wouldn't be able to afford to do that anymore, and that kind of thing is problematic.
Both Dick and I work for news organizations that do long-form investigative work. And the reason that there's a huge appetite for what we do is that most newspapers can't afford to do it anymore. It takes time, it takes travel money, it takes lawyers to back you up when you are going after somebody rich and powerful.
Yes, very important. Dick, so one of the things that Bill just alluded to is the strategy of the Times to become a national publication. We have national publications in the Times, the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, and the Washington Post re-energized. I think that's about it. Can that work? Do we think that will they be able to survive given the fact that there also are a lot of digital operations coming up that have national and international footprints?
I think some of them will be able to survive. I think they may end up the winners are likely to end up at somewhat smaller scale than they are now. But the key variable that's changed here is as we move to increasingly digital-only delivery, we have also now in the last 5 years or so made a lot of progress to digital subscription. And I think that is a viable model for, in my own view, for the limited number of news providers who have very high quality work in very high quantity. I see nobody who is succeeding in the paid digital subscription area who doesn't have both of those.
Very high quality work and
in very high quantity.
in very high quantity.
You know, to the extent that we've looked at it, for instance, for Pro Publica, I don't think there's any way that we could charge for content. I think our work is of good quality. I like to think so. But, you know, we're publishing 15 or 20 stories a week. The New York Times is publishing, what's your best guess, Bill, a day at this point? 50. No, total stories?
Huh?
Hundreds.
It's got to be hundreds.
Oh, hundreds, sure.
Hundreds. You know, if you can do that, I think you have a decent chance of attracting some digital subscription audience. Now, most of those folks, those 4 that you named, for instance, are chasing the journals a little bit less because they're in the business space more. But the Times, USA Today, and the Washington Post, I think, are largely chasing the same readers. And my guess looking at that audience is that they're probably enough to sustain 2 of them, and they're probably enough to sustain 2 of them at smaller scale than they have today, but at a very meaningful scale.
So if the quantity matters, that is bad news for regional newspapers who can't turn out the quantity of quality journalism, right?
Yeah, I do think that is the problem. I think with regional news organizations and large local news organizations, I think the paid model is going to prove very, very challenging. I don't know of anybody yet that is succeeding with it, and I do think this is the reason it's a problem. And if you can't get that second revenue stream, you're going to end up, I'm afraid, at a dramatically even lower scale. Now, having said that, that's all the bad news. I do think there is a business of being the leading news organization in any decent-sized place. And I think there ought to be a profitable business of that sort, but I do think it is likely to be a much smaller business than we expect and experience in most places today. And I think to manage from here to there, you're going to need to be really ruthless about what you are producing that is essentially local, is essentially original, and is decent quality.
Mm-hmm. And it may well then turn out, you're talking about having a single leading news organization in the community, so a newspaper may well find that its great competitor is the CBS affiliate or a new, if you're in a place like San Diego, a local, where a local online pure play has come out.
Absolutely, or for instance, as is occurring already in a number of communities around the country, the nonprofit, the public radio station.
Yeah.
Right. So given that, Pamela, talk to us about how you train students now. You've been for some years you were the director of undergraduate studies at NYU for journalism. What in the world do you teach young people now, given this uncertainty?
It's kind of funny because people say, well, why are students still going into journalism? I think if you look at programs all over the country, the numbers are going up. And I say because they don't read, but that's a joke. That's a joke because actually, one of the last Pew studies found that young people are reading online content and news at a higher rate than people over 50, which is a pretty surprising and great trend. And so they are reading, and what I find for my students is they read a lot, they just read a lot across different media, different platforms. So what do I tell them? I mean, students, you know, I was fortunate to get my training at a newspaper. Harry Rosenfeld was my first editor. So I got my training in a newsroom, and those opportunities don't really exist for young people anymore. So if they want to go into journalism, many, for the most part, will train in a journalism program. And so that kind of substitutes the role that smaller papers played for journalists of my generation. And so, you know, young people, they have to learn everything. I think the number one thing that I wish more people, not just journalism majors, but everyone needs to learn media literacy. How do you even consume news? I mean, you know, I think many of us assumed that people knew the difference between fake news and, you know, legitimate news and news sources, but guess what? They don't. And so media literacy is something that I think more and more is something that we're going to have to, as a society, get a handle on. How do we educate Americans about, you know, the question is, will newspapers survive? Will the news media survive? What that means is we're questioning whether our democracy will survive, right? You know, we're not just talking about business. We're not talking about just a business, the journalism business. We're talking about something that is integral to our democracy. And so it's something that, you know, Pro Publica and the New York Times, all of these, you know, different approaches to news, we need all of it, and we're going to need more of it. But without the public being educated about the role of journalism in a free society, none of this is going to work.
Well, Phil Keller, you might have a thought on this. How do you teach people to differentiate between publicity, propaganda, public relations, advertising, the journalism of verification that we practice? How do you think it's possible so that people will recognize, I like the phrase, great journalism will survive only if there's an audience that can recognize it. So how can you teach that?
Well, it's become a harder question to answer given the confusion of stuff that's available on the internet. I mean, and some of it is deliberately confusing. I'm naming no names. I think it starts in about 4th grade. I don't think you can take full-fledged adults and somehow browbeat them into becoming intelligent, discriminating news consumers. I think you start very young. Just as you learn to read, you learn to think about what you read. You know, the sort of early phases of critical thinking.
And yet, the Ford and Knight Foundations have put money into news literacy training on the college level, but you know, in our schools, the curricula are pretty packed. It's pretty hard to think how you get news literacy training into those classrooms.
Well, call it critical thinking.
Call it.
Or civics.
Yeah, yeah. Cool. Interesting. But it does kind of, part of it comes too to the ice cream and broccoli conversation, you know, the news that we know that we need and the news that we like. You know, we all know that our diets are somewhat imbalanced. We really know that we should be eating vegetables, but boy, we like ice cream. And you know, our decisions in the news diet that we give to people are the same. Now, HuffPost is a very interesting case because you really have a range. I read your work all the time. Every day I get like 3 HuffPost newsletters, or maybe 5. I don't know. It seems like I'm always getting stuff from HuffPost.
That's good. We're doing our job then.
You're doing
Great.
your job. You're pushing it out there. how do you, and part of this is, I think, your revenue stream is, you are getting advertising revenue because you're not getting it from me as a subscriber. Are you able to support great journalism with the dollars that are coming in from the fun stuff, or are you going to have to focus on the videos and the showbiz coverage in order to keep the thing afloat?
I think that answer is still trying to be figured out, and if I had it, I probably wouldn't share it here tonight. I would be off on a plane to a beach somewhere to celebrate that I was the one to figure out this riddle. But I do think that there will be some combination of, and so this applies to HuffPost, it applies to my time working in tabloid newspapers, which was, I always believed that we're selling two things. We're selling ice cream and we're selling broccoli. And we sell, the ice cream is going to make us more money, but it's going to pay for all the broccoli that gets old and moldy in the back, right? Mm-hmm. But the broccoli is more important than the ice cream. So right now at a place like HuffPost, it's about sheer numbers, and it's about getting the most eyeballs to see as much of the work as possible. Unfortunately, the ice cream draws that. But again, to what Dick was talking about earlier, this is digital pennies to what was once print dollars, which then creates this vicious sort of cycle of, okay, well now we need more, and then we need more, and then so you need, infinitely more of your digital ice cream to get, just what you were getting for your broccoli print dollars, and that's not sustainable. So there has to be another couple of facets to the formula, and you see various places they're experimenting with this in other ways, whether it's through sponsorships. There are soft paywalls. I'm with Dick. I don't necessarily think that is going to be the model to sustain digital journalism. I also think that if you look at it, when we talk about, like, there's going to be three, very large news organizations that will probably survive at a smaller size. I agree with that, but it sort of ends up mocking or sort of ends up mimicking the model that's happening right now in other industries. Like Amazon, there's Google, and there's Facebook, and they all have monopolies over what they're doing, and then there's like nobody else. And I'm exaggerating for the sake of the point, but I fear that we could end up in that same sort of situation when it comes to the news media, because I don't know that it's sustainable for as many of the outlets that we, as Pamela said, that would be really necessary for a flourishing democracy.
Well, I covered the breakup of Ma Bell when I was a young reporter. Maybe it just needs an occasional cleansing through antitrust laws.
We could be at that. We could be living through that moment, and maybe 100 years from now, some kid in a fourth grade class will hopefully be reading about that, and that will be the case. But if it feels like that now, as we're the frog in the boiling water, that's sort of what it feels like.
Mm-hmm. An interesting thing, talking about the way you shape the diet, and thinking about the big story of the day, of course, is the President of the United States. Kurt Anderson was here night before last, speaking under the Writers Institute aegis. Kurt's for those of you who weren't there at the ballroom on the Uptown campus, Kurt's the former editor of New York Magazine, founder of Spy. Hosts a public radio show, Studio 360, and has written a great book called Fantasyland about 500 years of American history, basically putting forth the notion that we are really susceptible to fantasies and magical thinking, and that has delivered to us the life that we have now, including our political life. And one of the things that he said is, Trump understands that desire to be entertained above all. To have a new Donald Trump show every day is his goal. Now, that's an interesting approach, and I wonder if we have caught up to that kind of, to being able to deal with that kind of a political figure in our coverage, and if it doesn't say something, though, also about what kind of a product we need to be shaping. If people are looking for a Donald Trump show, aren't they also looking for a media product that would be as entertaining. Dick, you want to try to do that?
I'm probably a little bit contrarian on this. I'm not, well, let me put it this way. If someone who really understood American politics had been told on the morning after the election when everyone was in shock about how the president's legislative program has played out or how his poll ratings have played out, I think they would certainly have recognized what I think we frequently don't, which is the administration is failing. Now, it may yet get salvaged, but at the moment it is failing. And the president is a failure. He's a failure by his own standards, and he's a failure in historical standards. And you know, and you can just see that in his public opinion polls. I mean, so here's some just sort of simple facts. The president is riding right now very close to his historic lows in the polls. They are below already after 9 months, 7 of his last 11 predecessors' all-time low point. So in those 7 predecessors, over a collective 42 years as President of the United States, he's managed to come in below them already in a very strong economy. Now, how does this matter about the news? It matters this way. How did all these people get this impression? How did everybody get the impression the president's not doing a very good job, which is what the very significant majority of the American people say? I think they got it from the news. So I don't think the show's working. Now, you know, will it work in the second year? Maybe, it's possible. If anybody learned anything last year or got reminded of anything, it would be to be a little careful on predictions. But so far, if you're in the political business, I would say not working very well. Prospects not great.
But he's doing a lot of damage in the meantime.
Well, no, I'm not defending or attacking the president's program on the merits. I'm saying I think the coverage of the president has been more effective, and I think the readers in the country are better informed and are actually reaching a mature and considered judgment about the president. And one of the reasons the president is increasingly in a bad mood is I would suspect that at some corner of his psyche, he understands that.
I agree with you, but do you think the same thing can be said of the year before he was actually elected?
Right, that's the problem.
That the press was doing its job?
No, look, and I think, I don't, and I think that there are a lot of shortcomings in the coverage of politics and the coverage of public policy, but I actually think in terms of the Trump show, I think the Trump show has actually been pretty well covered.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think what you're intimating is if the media was doing as good a job then as they're doing now, we may not have the Trump show. He was not scrutinized to the level he should have been during the campaign. He was treated like a comedy act and not like a person who would have nuclear codes. He was not treated as someone who could do the kind of damage that a president can do.
There was some great coverage during that time, some really strong investigative reporting laying out who Donald Trump really was, all over the major papers, certainly.
The newspapers, I
Yeah,
would say,
right.
but not television.
Not cable
news,
television.
yeah.
I think that's, you know, I resented Amy Goodman's indictment
Right.
last night
The
of
broad brush.
all of
yeah.
us. She lumped together everybody in the media, and I wanted to say, well, we report about climate change. You know, but so there was some great reporting, but I just don't know that it cut through an audience that is primarily focused on cable television. Is
Well,
that-
I think going to Pamela's point, I think the biggest single mistake last year was that nobody believed it was going to happen. I think this
Exactly. He wasn't taken seriously.
this whole thing comes down in many ways to that. I actually think the more you look at the Russia thing, I think the Russians didn't think this was going to happen, right? I think the only way this all makes sense is that the Russians were in some sense working on behalf of the Trump campaign, and it may well turn out working with the Trump campaign, but I think it's hard to argue from what we learned, what we know now, that they expected it to win. I think they were running an operation aimed at President-elect Clinton. The press was running an operation aimed at President-elect Clinton. The voters were thinking about how they felt up and down about President-elect Clinton, and nobody gave enough consideration to, yes, there's actually 2 people on the ballot, and the other one could win.
The other thing, though, the other part of this that I think we can't overlook, and we were talking about it a little bit earlier, is that, the elements of like the effects of gerrymandering, voter suppression, the Russia element, these were all sort of, to varying degrees, unknowns. Or, now, they were unknown because they were unknowable, or possibly because, as an industry, we failed to know them better and to communicate that to our readers. But the effects of, I look at this election and it's a bit of a mirage. I mean, I don't know that it's 100% purely a reflection of what the citizenship of this country is truly feeling. I'm still not convinced of that. And until we find out exactly what the true extent of the influence of any of those other 3 elements were, I'm not going to be convinced of it.
I think maybe another lesson from last year is that journalism has become a slave to metrics. The most obviously the polling, a lot of which was not very good, and sort of, convinced everybody that it was a dead cert that Clinton was going to win. But even beyond that, if you look at the kind of national metrics, the balance of trade, the unemployment rate, all of the crime rate, they were all pretty good, and kind of led us to believe that the Americans were probably pretty satisfied. They don't they don't tell you what's at the other end of the bell curve that arrived at those numbers. The people who are actually living in high crime neighborhoods, the people who were laid off, the people who are pissed off about trade deals.
The growing income inequality.
The growing income inequality.
The people who are angry that there was a black man in the White House. I mean, these are all things that 100% affected this, and possibly we didn't do a good enough job of covering.
To what extent
we
might...
were post-race.
What's that?
We were post-race last year.
Oh, yeah, right, post-race, absolutely.
Didn't last very long.
To what extent, though, might the journalistic failure have something to do with, a practice in journalism that I think most of us probably thought we had gotten over, which is the false equivalency, the effort to find balance in stories. I've often wondered what would have happened if journalists hadn't paid so damn much attention to the emails. Wasn't that an unfair effort to wasn't the coverage out of balance to what Secretary Clinton actually did with her emails?
Yes, I would say she suffered from a scandal deficit. Trump had a scandal every week, and so you sort of forgot the previous week's scandal. She only had, arguably the emails in Benghazi, and Benghazi was you have to stretch a bit to make a scandal out of that. In fact, you have to stretch a bit to make much of a scandal out of the emails. But there was, I think, a sense and this was particularly true, again, picking on television, that okay, well, we're covering the fraud at Trump's university, and the Republicans' response to that is, yeah, but what about the emails? So we're going to quote the Republicans saying, what about the emails?
I know this is not going to be popular in this room, having been in this room part of the day, but I have to say I actually think the emails, while they seem silly now because of some of the truly crazy things that are going on, were a serious problem. I would just say, to go back to the beginning of it, I just think we've sort of forgotten. This was done by the Secretary of State of the United States to defeat congressional oversight and the Freedom of Information Act. The Secretary of State of the United States is probably, and certainly historically, the second or third most powerful officer of our government. Congressional oversight is absolutely essential to our constitutional system, and certainly we in the press, and I hope citizens, think the Freedom of Information Act is also a classic and important part of oversight of power in our government. Someone who tries to set up a system so they hide from both things systematically for 4 years, and who then offers themselves for President of the United States, has, in my judgment, raised very serious questions about what kind of president they would be, and how they think about the democratic system of government. Do I think for a minute that that ranks with, the Billy Bush interview or probably 10 things that happened last week? No, I do not. But do I think it is a really serious issue for which she deserved great sanction? I guess I do.
All right. One of the interesting things, though, is that people, because of the people who were yelling "lock her up" in the rallies are the same people who have such a limited level of trust in the American media, which may be one of the issues that is confronting the media in marketing, or maybe not. I mean, the initial explanation that we started out with is that the difficulty confronting the future of the industry really is primarily traceable to a business problem. To a disruptive influence in the business sector. But, the declining trust in all American institutions has been actually even more acute in the press. Now, there's been a little bit of improvement. An Ipsos poll last week came back saying that 48% of Americans have some or a great deal of trust in the news media. That's up by 9 points from 39% a year ago. But still, that means that more than half of the people in America don't have any trust at all in the news media to be telling the truth. Why has that happened?
Well, it doesn't help when you have a president of the United States who's saying everything that journalists do is fake. How could that help?
But it predates that, right? We've been declining.
Well, it depends on the population. For so long, the news media, I'm more reluctant these days to be critical of the news media because it's in crisis, right? When I wrote my book almost 20 years ago, I was very critical of the news media and the ways in which it ignored the problems of African Americans, Latinos, and other marginalized groups, poor people, whether white or any race. So those things are real, and I think the alienation that many people feel is real, and I think the news media has done a lot to earn that kind of disaffection. But that said, it is so important. All of my criticism of the media has always come from a place of love and reverence for the role of journalism in a free society. And so even as I critique the media, I realize how important it is and that we cannot give up on it. And, I just know that we can do better. But these days, I'm a lot less critical. In fact, I think we've seen some of the greatest journalism in my lifetime over the past year. And,
if you ask voters how they feel about Congress, they rank down with the media. They rank just somewhere below pond scum.
Yeah.
But if you ask people how they feel about their own specific named governor or senator or representative, the answer is much more likely to be, great guy, I voted for him 12 times. He should always run unopposed. And I think something of the same order is true of the media. If you talk about the media collectively,
right.
I'm not sure what kind of ratings I would give the media collectively.
But
if you talk about the thing that you consume, whether it's Fox News
right.
or the New York Times, people do trust it.
Yeah, people trust their local media more than they do national media. So.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think, frankly, the president's poll ratings prove that, right? People do not read negative coverage and reach a negative conclusion unless they trust at some level whoever it is who's telling them.
Although it's hard to say that the president's poll ratings have any effect. At the time of the election, I remember seeing exit polls that said that 2/3 of American voters thought that Trump was dishonest, but they voted for him anyway. And so that is at least 1/3 of the voters thought that he wasn't honest, but that's okay. So I don't know how much...
because they thought Hillary was dishonest,
I guess maybe
too.
that's it. Maybe
Well, because they think politicians in general, they think that's just part of the job is being dishonest, whereas with the news, with the media, I think that there's I think that people get upset about that, right? Because we're supposed to be honest, and most of the time, we are. And so, again, I do think what Bill said is 100% right. There is I love the New York Post because it's or the New York Daily News because it's my hometown paper, but boy, the media sucks, right? That is 100% the case.
How much can this be, by the way, can the media influence honesty by advertising campaigns even? Now the New York, the Washington Post has this new slogan, "Democracy dies in darkness." It's pretty dramatic. And of course, the Times has always used all the news that's fit to print. It doesn't I just wonder if there's anything new. Can't we sell it like people sell popcorn? Isn't there something that can actually lure people to the product?
I actually think one of the big trends in our society in many, many ways is you talk about the problems of news literacy, and they do exist, but I actually think advertising literacy is through the roof, which is another way of saying that people are much more sophisticated and actually much more dubious about marketing of all sorts, and that transparency, radical transparency, is actually much more effective than it's ever been before. So a refuge in marketing would not be my recommendation.
Mm-hmm.
And also seeing the surges that we're seeing in circulation at those papers, I mean, I think they can be models, right? The kind of journalism that they're doing, when people feel that you're giving them something that they really need, and that's what people feel right now, they buy it.
So if Dick is right that there really is not enough money in a typical local market to sustain, from a readership sponsorship standpoint, readership for very much of the aggressive journalism, what about not-for-profit newsrooms? Two of you.
You mean not-for-profit on purpose?
Intentionally not-for-profit, yeah. Not. Exactly. Yes. So that's right. There are two of you here who are intentionally in not-for-profits, right? So we love HuffPost, but yeah. All right. So is there, now, people have always worried about the advertiser influence on the news product of advertiser-supported publications like my newspaper. But what about the influence in the not-for-profit world? Is there not a danger that entities that are supported by the generosity of donors might make news coverage reflective of that as well?
Sure. There is a theoretical danger of that, absolutely. What we do to address it at Pro Publica is we have a number of safeguards. One, we disclose, we're required on our tax returns to disclose what we take in some detail, and what we pay people in some detail, but we actually disclose every donor to our organization $5,000 and above. We're not required to do that. We're required to file it with the government, but we're not required to put it out publicly, but we do. We also have a rule that we never disclose stories that we're working on to any donor, even to our own board of directors, before it's published. We never discuss stories with them. And, the answer is there's better news organizations and worse news organizations on this issue. There always have been. And you've got to, I think, build up some credibility on this point and to have processes that people ought to be able to trust if you follow them. And then people will see, are you running a trustworthy news organization? I think there have always been newspapers in this country, and you know this surely, local papers, for instance, that bend to advertisers in some communities. And in the journalism business, people say that publisher over there and that one over there, are a little squishy, but that one over there and that company over there are really known for integrity. And I think the same thing will be true with donors. You have to put in safeguards and you have to follow them.
The one other safeguard, and I think this is true of Pro Publica, it certainly is true of the Marshall Project, is you got to get a diversity of funders. It's a mix of, for us, a mix of foundations and people I've learned to refer to as high net worth individuals. And we're consciously trying to reduce the portion that comes from foundations, because those tend to be great big grants that if you lose it, it's going to blow a hole in the side of your ship, and get more. We've started a membership drive, which will be a relatively tiny portion of our revenues, but everything you can do to sort of broaden the base of support means you're not susceptible to the influence of any one donor.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So we had 26,000 donors last year. And, I think that makes a big difference. And we started with one major donor that was giving us almost all of our money 10 years ago. And now they are down to, and they are still the largest, but they are down to less than 15%. In another couple of years, they'll be less than 10.
So is this model replicable on a local level? Should I convince the nice folks at Hearst that they want to deliver my newspaper into not-for-profit hands intentionally?
Well, first of all, the smaller the pond, the more likely the sharks will get a bite at you. So it works better on a larger scale. And also, one of the things that we're discovering, and I expect Dick has discovered this too, is that it's not the problem is not so much that funders want you to tilt the news a particular way. It's that they want you to focus on a particular problem.
Right.
So, we'll give you money to write more about juvenile justice or mental health in prisons or which is fine as long as it's a subject that we're writing about anyway. But occasionally somebody wants to offer us money to write about something that really is not in our strength, and we say no.
Mm-hmm.
I think, Rex, the paper in Tampa, Florida, as you know, and I don't know if folks here may or may not, was given away by its owner upon his death. That is to say, he didn't leave it to his heirs, he left it to a nonprofit. I guess 40 years ago, the paper in Philadelphia has just been given effectively to a nonprofit. I think that will happen more, but the only way it happens is if whoever is holding whatever economic interest there is left wants to give it away. And for a public company, I think that's essentially impossible, as long as there is economic value.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because of the way public companies are structured in this country. There are microphones out here, and if you all would like to line up at the microphones to ask questions, we'll move to that in just a second here. I came across something in a book written before the great disaster that we have confronted. Right, there are still microphones, aren't there? One in each aisle? Yeah, okay, thank you. I can't quite see with the lights. Philip Meyer, who was a journalism professor, a very thoughtful guy, wrote a book in 2004 called The Vanishing Newspaper. And he wrote, "The only way to save journalism is to develop a new model that finds profit in truth, vigilance, and social responsibility." So does that model exist? Are we still struggling to find it?
That sort of implies that model went away, and I don't know that, or that mission went away, and I don't know that mission ever vanished. It's that the business model attached to it evaporated, and so my father, used to buy the New York Daily News and the New York Post 5 days a week. He'd come home and he'd drop them on the coffee table, and he probably spent a quarter on each day. So you do the rough math. He was spending about $100 a year for that information. Now he's getting it all for nothing. If he wanted to, he still, because he's a dinosaur, he still does that. But those, what happened to the dinosaurs? But my point is, I don't know that desire to spend $100 or whatever the amount is has gone away. I think it's just been circumvented into an area, and we need to kind of corral it back somehow. And again, as I said earlier, we're all struggling for that answer at this point, and not just us, but many, many other people who might even be smarter than all of us are also struggling with that, and coming up with some little sort of, examples of success, but more often than not, it's back to the drawing board. And we've seen that a lot at publications, both digital and print, where they're reinventing themselves every 2, 3, 4 years because the great idea from 3 years ago didn't quite work out. So it doesn't really answer the question. I think it's a slightly, it just shifts the question slightly.
Great. Okay, first question right out here.
So I do earn media for a living, and I call reporters all the time, especially on issues of social justice for a lot of nonprofit groups. And one thing that my friends have been asking me is, how do we get more coverage of the issues that they care about in the media? And I've been telling them that they should perhaps call the media and ask for such stories. Is that a good approach, or what should someone, just an average citizen, do to get what they want to see covered in the papers?
That's a good idea. If you see a reporter who's doing the kind of stories that, resonate with what you'd like covered, that would be the person to call.
Yeah, stories don't sort of fall from the sky. They come from conversations. 90-some% of the stories that we do at the Marshall Project bubble up from the reporters who are talking to advocates and lawyers and victims and all sorts of people. And a phone call to a reporter may not always seem welcome, but as a general rule, it is.
It makes me wonder, though, as an average citizen, is it a failed cause if the overhead people and the advertising departments are overseeing all of this and not going to let that happen anyways? Like, if you're a person of color and you call up the paper and say, can you do a story on this? The reporter's excited, pitches it, and then the advertisers get mad and say it's a bad idea and they can't do it.
We don't have an advertising department.
Yeah, it doesn't.
And the dynamic that I described earlier, I exaggerated for the sake of the anecdote slightly, but I don't want it to think, because like my job as the editor-in-chief was to be the buffer between that and the actual execution of the journalism. So I don't know of any. There might be some newsrooms that operate that way.
Doesn't
Yeah.
happen.
No, I'm so happy to hear you say that. I'm going to forward this to my friends on Facebook, because I actually try and make this point to them, and they don't think it works that way. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. And that's true. There aren't the advertising folks don't get to talk about that kind of stuff. We don't allow.
They talk about it, they don't get to dictate it.
When Harry Rosenfeld was the editor of the Times-Union, I don't think you allowed somebody from advertising into the newsroom, did you? They were persona non grata, almost. It's probably true. Yes, over here.
Hi. We all seen the image of Truman holding the picture, Dewey wins, correct? Oh, sorry.
He's very tall.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
We all seen the pictures that Truman holding the newspaper, Dewey wins, right? Governor Dewey wins. Did that happen last year? And who's responsible for that?
Yes. We had 3 front pages all ready to go. We kind of thought it might be close, but we really didn't think we were going to have to use the one that we did. We ended up going, we held as late as we could, and ended up with a big cover with 2 big pictures and a big question mark down the middle, too close to call, which is not as bad as 2000, when through the night, as the issues kept changing between Bush and Gore, we changed the front page 4 times. We eventually had it right accidentally, because we had Bush winning before he actually had, of course, but we actually did have Gore winning in the first edition. It was not a good night. So, yes, over here.
Yeah, I've been a loyal reader of the TU for about 30 years. I really think it's a great newspaper, because I read a lot of newspapers around the country. But I also read online, because I think online offers 2 things. It offers embedded video, and it offers some very valuable links. My question is more broad, however, and that is the threat to independence of local media. I'm really more talking, I guess, about television, because I'm concerned about the growth of Sinclair News, which I understand now has 70% of the households and 50% of the people get their information from local news. And the deal they apparently cut with Trump, especially Jared Kushner, who said, we'll give you access if you give us fair treatment. And so we saw the coverage of it. My concern is that they require embedding their stories in local news. I wonder if the panel would like to comment on that, and whether or not that is or may be an issue for print journalism.
Sinclair owns the CBS affiliate in this market. So you all know about Sinclair and what they're doing. Anybody want to take on the question of what the impact of this might be?
I think to put it in a broader context, I think the problem of intentional bias in news is a very serious one. It's really the last panel and others, probably not the subject for tonight. I do not actually think the purely fake news problem is going to turn out to be an enduring problem myself. I think it's a problem for the platforms to manage and one they are actually well along to beginning to manage. But I think the problem of intentional bias, and particularly how social media makes it much easier to confirm your bias, is a very serious problem in news in this country. I hope it will be of some comfort to you to know, if you don't already, that it has been a problem in this country for 240 years. It was almost certainly at its height in the late 18th century, which was also the time of the greatest statesmanship in the history of this country and the time when most of the greatest things accomplished by our government were laid down. So I think it is something that we can overcome, but I do think it's a serious issue.
And how can that be changed? If we all are looking to media that confirm our biases, that is built into the model of the digital platforms.
I would say the first way to change it in your own life is if you think you're being told something that is slanted, that wants to have the answer before it has posed the question, change the channel. Change the channel on TV, change the channel on the internet, because at the end of the day, it's actually not helpful to you, right? If you're being told all the time that Trump is succeeding in everything, and then you wake up and notice, gee, they're not passing any bills, and oh my goodness, you wake up next November and discover they voted out most of the people who like him. And then the following 2 years, he loses by 20 points. That you haven't helped yourself, right? You just keep getting surprised that the nonsense you're being given isn't true. And, there are counter biases. So I think the net effect of them is probably not huge. The polarization effect is huge, but you're not doing yourself a favor if you're interested in news to watch news being given to you by somebody who's giving you their preferences and not the actual facts.
Over here.
Hi, my name is Zachary St. Hubert. I'm a senior at UAlbany. My name is Zachary St. Hubert. I'm a senior at UAlbany, and I'm actually doing a research paper on this. I just wanted to know what you guys think, what role social media has played in increasing political participation, whether it be amongst young people or just anyone in general. And how often do you guys use social media, to put your news out there?
The impact of social media.
Is this where we all beat up on the internet again?
Well, the impact is huge. 2/3 of the news that's consumed on politics is on social media. What the impact of it on young people, I don't know if that makes you guys more active or not, but it probably does. But the problem that we're talking about is social media also has problems with a screen, and whether or not people can distinguish between legitimate news and fake news, propaganda. That is the problem that we're talking about, because social media is vast. So you can be talking about the New York Times. You can go on Twitter and you can get the Wall Street Journal. You can get anything on social media. So social media is not really telling us much. You want to dig down and what are we talking about? What is it that people are seeing on Facebook? Everything from the New York Times to something from Breitbart to something that's entirely fabricated. So that's the problem with social media.
Excuse me. And I think that, and this ties into the other gentleman's question about Sinclair, and it's what you talked about earlier, which is news literacy. And if we work from the assumption that as a country we are happy with our level of news literacy, then a couple of things start happening. One, places like Sinclair start becoming marginalized because people are more aware of what they're being told or not being told. And then social media is possibly one of the greatest inventions in human history, if everybody is fully understanding what it is that they're being bombarded by. Because as you said, you have access that no other human being before us has ever had.
The difficulty with social media, and we are all using it, right now about 20% of our digital traffic comes from social media, and we're trying to hike that all the time by more intelligently using it, by timing it correctly. The difficulty with it is that you really can't control it. We can send out little carriers with newspapers to throw them on doorsteps and be pretty sure that they're going to get delivered. To the shrubbery anyway, they get delivered somewhere. But the difficulty is with social media, you are really dependent upon the platforms, and they may well be changing their algorithms to diminish the impact of your work, and you have to constantly stay on top of it. But it is a powerful method, and we are increasingly relying upon various platforms. Our reporters are trained to deliver stories on Twitter, Instagram. Of course, everything goes out on Facebook. Everything of value, and even Snapchat to a certain extent. So we're trying to make great use of it.
This is going to be repeating what a lot of others have said, but it's just worth underscoring that you can control your news diet. If you don't control it, an algorithm will control it for you, or your friends will control it for you by sending you things that they think you already believe. But you can subscribe, you have a choice what you subscribe to online. You can sign up for newsletters that aggregate interesting stuff from a variety of points of view. If people paid as much, even a fraction as much time and attention to organizing their news diet as they do to organizing what they actually eat, we'd probably have a healthier country.
Yeah.
And one last very important part of this is that, and you touched on this a little bit, is that up until very, very recently, there's been no conversation to holding the companies who own and operate and curate these platforms to the same level that we're holding the media companies. So, as the president would say, I think somebody should look into that.
Thank you.
Over here.
What the hell is going on?
All right, yeah.
My turn, thank you. I have a sort of a part question, part suggestion for a project here maybe, and a long-term one. This afternoon, I guess it was this morning actually, the cyber crimes, et cetera, dirty deeds thing. Who's the name of the person from the CIA? Spencer was his last name? Yeah, he played Putin, yes, for folks that were here. That was very amusing. He talked about, I mean, some people tend to throw the term fake news out very indiscriminately, and he was distinguishing from a government perspective white, gray, or black propaganda. I think it's part of the education for people in general, and students in particular, would be a lot of these types of distinctions. Like white propaganda, I guess, is something that's factual, but it's advantageous to you and you put it out there. Gray is some facts mixed in with a kind of a misleading story, and black propaganda is totally false. And it made me think of that might be part of a basis for, or maybe there is something like this already, or maybe something more like this could be developed, a sort of a, to steal a phrase, an adversary characteristic matrix for different types of misleading media, or how, like if there was a grid to distinguish levels of opinion to complete fakeness, to accuracy, to partially to misleading, like if there is and maybe even an interactive tool to that effect.
To evaluate media on its...
To evaluate any form of information coming from anywhere, frankly.
For bias,
yes.
or for...
for bias, for anything, for any... like in the case of white propaganda, supposedly it's all true, but it's directed in a certain way, and governments use it.
Interesting.
So sort of like PolitiFact, right? Where they kind of grade whether something's true,
Okay,
partially true, false, yeah.
Yeah, like how do you distinguish opinion from,
The problem with that then is that even with a site like PolitiFact, there are groups of people who will point the fake news finger at them, you know, when they're saying that something is propaganda as opposed to fact, and it's the propaganda that actually makes somebody feel warm and fuzzy inside.
It seems like it would be easier just to consume news that comes from a legitimate news source than it is to go through this matrix of, you know, who's doing all of that screening?
Well, I guess part of my inspiration for my question is something I heard of called checkology, which I first heard of from NPR last December, right after the election, and that is something developed by this news literacy project, and it's a syllabus, I guess, or lots of different elements that can add up to a syllabus to teach in the grades or high school or wherever about how to distinguish and how to fact check and how to evaluate news, and it's our actual school program. So maybe I've only looked at the website a little bit. Maybe something like that could be further developed.
The guy who created the News Literacy Project began his career, like Pamela's, in the newsroom here in Albany, and like Lydia Polgreen also began their careers here. So we thank you. That's a great notion. We'll look into that at the News Literacy Project. Yes, here.
Hi, my name is Claire. I am a fellow with the Roper Center for Public Opinion Research over at Cornell, and I stumbled upon a really striking and relevant survey this summer, which found that the vast majority of Americans are very concerned about fake news as it applies societally, very concerned, threatens our democracy, etc. And then it gets interesting because you ask Americans individually, how confident are you in your own ability to analyze sources? And of course, most people are very confident in their own ability to detect fake news. So my question is, how do we ensure that these media literacy initiatives are compelling and are taken seriously by American people, including those who are experiencing some very amusing overconfidence effects?
I think that Bill touched on this earlier when he mentioned, you know, start teaching this in 4th grade, and I think that you could make a case for starting it earlier than that. You know, it's an essential aspect of being a citizen of this country. And Pamela said civics, which has gone by the wayside as well. No, there are no civics classes anymore. You know, so I think that is really, and it might be an oversimplification, but it really feels that simple.
The difficulty is that means that the current generation of adults is lost.
Yeah, that might be the case. And you know, the other part of this is that if there's another, it's not necessarily an industry, but if there's another area of this country that's suffering as much or more than media, it's education. And so there's not funding for this type of you know, learning, and there's not the creative thinking, you know, or the will to actually institute it. So again, this becomes a little like a dog chasing its tail, but it goes to the core of, I think both of the problems are clearly connected.
Thank you. Over here.
Yeah, my name is Ellie Rose. I have two. Okay, looking at how particular subjects are covered in terms of Israel-Palestine, in a newsroom, from a newsroom perspective, when things come in from UP or API, the two major sources, how does one decide what news facts will be published about Israel-Palestine? What are the pressures to publish or not publish?
I don't feel any pressures. I'm sorry, actually, we're a local newspaper, so we publish very little news from there. So the principal determinant is, what does it fit? That's only partially facetious. I think that I don't know of any particular pressure that is brought to bear. I think that there's a flawed sense of how decisions are made in newsrooms about what news goes in. When you're the editor of a newspaper, you're not sitting there at night saying, run this story, don't run this story, run this story, nor are you saying, I don't want any stories that reflect...
Well, I'm assuming that you get from two sources. One would be local reporters and would be international sources, which could be UP and API. Is that correct or incorrect?
Well, actually, it's a little bit outdated. I mean, there's now principally only... UPI is essentially gone. AP is the dominant wire service for general news for American newspapers, but there are, as part of the opening up of this international wire services that are much more available to American newspapers than there used to be. But I think, going back to Rex's point, the newspapers that run a lot, or the news organizations that run a lot of information on that issue at this point, are the ones that have people there, and they're going to run the stories from their own folks when they're ready.
Who they trust.
You know, so the New York Times has a bureau chief there, and bureau, and when those people tell them, you know, here's the story, it goes through the editing process and it runs. And there's enough pressure, I think, on the space side, you know, as Rex was pointing out, that that may have been a model of this 30 years ago, but in today's world, the only people who have space for this are people who have reporters there, by and large, and they're going to run with their own staff, tells them the news is.
Right, the ones that can put reporters in certain places or
Right.
are able to.
Right.
Okay, over here. I'm just about out of time.
With so much focus on Trump and the national Washington and stuff, do you think that local news is hurting? And do you think that with so much attention focused on Trump, that people are becoming spectators rather than participants in politics?
Sorry, Bill. I think on the first point, I don't know that they're necessarily connected. The focus on Trump may be exacerbating what was already a very dire situation as far as local news coverage goes and the sustainability of local news, which we've touched on a little bit here tonight. As far as becoming spectators instead of engaged citizens of the country, I think the same thing holds true. I think Trump has exacerbated what was already a pretty significant problem. It's just easier for us to identify it now because of the circus that has been the nonstop 24/7 coverage of his administration.
So yeah, I think local coverage has been suffering for a long time before Donald Trump arrived on the scene. The worst of it, I would say, and I'll make an exception for the city we're sitting in now, but is state capitals. I can't remember the numbers, but the erosion of reporters assigned to cover state legislatures has been severe and noticeable by the number of scandals and arrests that take place in state legislatures that get discovered years after the fact.
Thank you.
We're good there. We're good there. We're arresting him right contemporaneously.
But I think that I don't get the sense that citizens have become spectators to Trump. I see a lot of citizen engagement. I see, like, there were 900 people here yesterday. You know, there are people here, this is Saturday night, right?
What's wrong with you folks?
I'm sure there are a lot of exciting things to do in Albany on a Saturday night, and here we are, like wrestling with, you know, the state of our democracy, right? In the state of our news media. So.
A baseball playoff.
And missing a baseball. I mean, you guys are here in a baseball. That's all they were talking about backstage. So
Baseball and Trump. I mean, let's be honest.
Yeah. But I don't get that sense, and I think to the extent that he's checking the score now.
Houston won in the ninth.
To the extent that this is a failed presidency, I think it has a lot to do with citizen engagement. You know, the things that he has tried to dismantle, he hasn't been that successful because people have been calling their senators and, you know, going to Washington. So I do think, and the fact that, you know, newspaper circulation is going up, which is like totally against the trend line of, you know, of the past 10 years, it is a testament to citizen engagement. So, you know, I hope people continue to stay engaged because he's still there.
Thank you.
So I want to thank you all for coming and helping us try to figure out a way to prevent folks from being...
One more.
I was,
Just
okay.
one.
Paul told me to ignore you.
They already missed the game.
Come on down.
Hi, my name's Richard. So my question actually dovetails with what the gentleman over here was asking about with, you know, how do you create literacy or have a system to sort of categorize all the misinformation out there. And there seems to be a lot of really interesting new approaches to the news business model that are coming out that I've seen lately that really haven't been mentioned much at this conference. And I apologize, it takes a little context here. And what I see happening, something very interesting that was said was how there's a concern that the news industry may consolidate kind of like down to Amazon and Google and that kind of way. And that same thing actually happened with the music business over the last 15 years. You know, initially the internet was sort of the enemy, and you know, it was worried about, the music industry was worried about being destroyed by the internet. Ultimately, Apple essentially became the largest music company. So there actually is a Albany-based company that has created a news rating platform that's kind of like Yelp for the news. And there's other companies like Wikipedia and like WikiTribune who are coming up with like new ways to approach the news industry. So here's my question. My question is the news industry actually like looking for new model solutions kind of outside of the traditional news bubble? Or are you really looking within and trying to say, like, how can we take the same thing we've been doing and just apply it to the internet? Like, are you really, just like the music business used to do, are you really looking at new business models that come from outside of the industry? Is that something that the news industry is even looking at?
You know, I don't frankly know what that means, but I think I think that there is an enormous amount of experimentation in the news business.
Publica is
Yeah.
one example of that. That's what the Marshall Project is another example of that.
I just think there's an enormous amount of experimentation in the news business, of innovation in the news business. I mean, you look at the innovation of video into text, audio into text, of deep data into narrative,
video. I mean,
of nonprofit forms, of hybrid forms, of digital subscriptions. I just think
a huge experimentation. Actually, you know, the News Technology Center at Columbia and Stanford, the joint effort to link technology and news to determine if there are better ways to deliver and to do storytelling.
Yeah, and I will say I completely agree with everything that's been said here tonight about the importance of news literacy in our individual lives and in our collective lives. I do not think a rating service is what this country needs. I think it needs better users, which is a responsibility that we all have to make ourselves. I think rating services come with enormous value judgments, and I do not believe in something that is as connected to our values and our political life and opinion as news, which is a good thing, right? That we argue about all this. That is what our democracy is premised on. I think the idea of a neutral arbiter of all those things is going to prove permanently elusive.
And if you will just indulge me for a minute to thank a few people before we conclude this panel. This has been a remarkable 2 days, 9 hours, 6 panels, challenging, illuminating, but also putting the power and the responsibility back to all of us in this democracy to be more better news consumers, to be more challenging what comes across our social media feed. But let me ask, just for a second before we go to the public reception, give me a moment to thank some people here. Our University at Albany president, Avidan Rodriguez, who was here for many panels. He was here yesterday and earlier today. And I really want to start where this all began 35 years ago, nearly 35 years ago. The founder and executive director of the Writers Institute, who made all this possible, William Kennedy. I want to say Bill remains our guiding star in all that we do. Also, Writers Institute Assistant Director Mark Koplik, Communications Specialist Michael Huber, Program Coordinator Jennifer Kowalski, Graphic Arts Director Janet Topel, Media Specialist John Warren, Graduate Assistant Jesse Poole, and Undergraduate Intern Kaylee Schultes. And finally, I come to a moment where I want to single out one person, our Associate Director, Suzanne Lance. She has been the unsung hero, doing all the jobs that nobody else wanted to do, all the behind-the-scene things that are essential to the successful operation of the Writers Institute. She's been the glue that held this together for the past 30 years. And she is retiring at the end of this year after 39 years serving the University at Albany. She never sought attention, never asked for recognition, preferred to stay in the background, but she's the most organized, efficient, hardworking, committed, selfless coworker I have ever known. And her support system is her husband, George, who's here at all the events. He's here again for the whole weekend. But Suzanne's legacy, you need to know this, is this remarkable filing system that she has on 2,000 plus writers who've come through here in 35 years. But more than that, she established our audio-visual archive. So all this archive, this symposium, will go into that. You need to know that that is gradually being digitized. That's one of John Warren's projects. It represents thousands of hours of irreplaceable interviews, discussions, readings with the world's greatest writers, many of whom are no longer living. It represents an extraordinary legacy and a literary treasure. I believe it's the most extensive audiovisual archives devoted to writers anywhere in the world. And Suzanne Lance is responsible for that and for so much more. And I know I'm embarrassing her terribly because she's a behind-the-scene person, but please publicly thank Suzanne Lance for 30 years of service to the Writers Institute and 39 years at the University at Albany. Yeah, stand up. That would be great. And as we conclude, before we go to the reception, let's one more thank this wonderful panel: Richard Tofel, Bill Keller, Pamela Newkirk, Jim Rich, and Rex Smith.